Home Depot today has 330,000 people. I've created jobs in America. I ran a business. I see what's going on today, and I'm frightened to death.
We have Republicans trying to redefine rape. If you think that this election won't affect you and your life, think again.
Families in this crash had received letters from President Obama that were not personalized. They were form letters. A family sacrifices their child, and you choose to send a form letter to them.
For you, Mr. Romney, it's about politics.
For us, it's about defending our country.
Defending our freedom.
We deserve a commander-in-chief that understands what's at stake.
But to trust you as commander-in-chief, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
As a veteran, I don't think so.
Sampling of the ads being run all across the country by the candidates' allies, independent expenditures. We're back now with the roundtable. George Will, Austan Goolsbee, Gwen, Ifill, Andrew Sullivan, and Nicolle, Wallace. Let's take a look at the closing arguments of the campaigns right now. George, you heard Andrew talk about how we saw different Mitt Romney at the debate. That seems to be the argument that President Obama and his allies are making. Look at Colin Powell when he endorsed President Obama this week.
One day he has a certain strong view about staying in Afghanistan, but then on Monday night he agrees with the withdrawal. Same thing in Iraq. On almost every issue that was discussed on Monday night, Governor Romney agreed with the president with some nuances. But this is quite a different set of foreign policy views than he had earlier in the campaign.
Now, George, that had been an argument the Obama people had kind of shied away from earlier in the campaign, preferring to paint Governor Romney as a hard-right conservative.
Well, that's right. Right now, that charge is really an accusation that Romney can live with, which is don't believe him, as Andrew says, because you might like him. And I think people say, well, look, our last impression of him, this is your closing argument, is of someone that we can live with. So I think the Obama attack is buttressing the Romney tactic.
You agree?
I don't think I do agree. I mean, I think if you're paying attention to the policy, it's got to at least worry you that he's got a bunch of stated policies in his platform, his vaunted 5-point economic plan. If you start unpacking them, there aren't any details, and what he's saying now is totally different from what he was saying before. I think that will make people nervous. I think they're going to say...
But if you flip to a popular policy, don't people usually accept that?
I don't think he's flipped to a popular policy. I think he's basically just... He's got a thing in writing that says my policy is A, and then he's saying, well, you say A is my policy, but it's not. I think people are going to be confused.
The problem is that Obama's eroding his own trust and credibility by not being able to settle on one or the other. You cannot be both wrong and coreless. So I think that Obama has undermined his own attack by not being able to settle on one. And listen, campaigns that are exhausted and stressed, and they both are. But to me, this is a little bit of a window into which campaign is feeling a little more battered and which campaign is enjoying a little bit of a teeny tiny bit more lift from the momentum. And you know, again, it doesn't matter who has the national momentum. This is coming down to essentially 7 like gubernatorial races, really. But I think that Obama has undermined his own attacks on Romney by not being able, by frankly flip-flopping.
Well, I'm sorry, but Romney was a severe conservative from January to October, and now he's the new candidate. What I'm amazed is why Republicans aren't scared about what he'll be in January or July.
Because we feel like
year.
whatever it is
He'll
better
do
than
whatever
Obama.
He wants. But how do you know that? Because he's supporting what will be a massive increase in debt. His math will balloon the debt just like Bush did. Tax cuts, increase in spending, and no details on how increase in defense spending, and no details about how to balance the budget.
Let's go back to
a war in Iran.
Let's go back to the foreign policy debate, which shockingly was less than a week ago. It feels like it was a month ago.
Right.
It was just Monday. But this is what the final message was for both of them that night. The final message for Mitt Romney was, I can be trusted. You can trust me. I'm going to speak for you, and I'm going to be a perfectly mellow, moderate choice. Let me finish. And the president's argument was that you cannot trust him. So the president was behaving as if he was the underdog. There's no question about that. That's what he came into that debate to do. And that's what then went out on the campaign trail all week. I don't know if the Romneysia argument really works. I don't know if people vote based on the fact that they don't know what the guy believes. Maybe they do.
Voters did think that President Obama won that last debate.
They do, because he came out scrapping.
Because Romney changed his entire foreign policy overnight. I mean, who is this guy? And why are we talking about how this affects the race rather than we have an obvious someone who has no core at all and has changed it a dozen times to appeal to whatever market share he's appealing to? Do you want that kind of person with that kind of character? Someone who has no character, essentially,
I think it will come
but what
down
advantages him in the moment?
To an actual argument about economics. And that argument is one side saying, well, conditions aren't that great, and the other side saying, but they were much worse and they've gotten somewhat better. And the dispute is really the Obama people saying, go look at Romney's policies. They're exactly what George Bush said in 2001. And Romney saying, well, look at the president. What he's for hasn't worked. And that's kind of the last argument that's going to go for the last few days.
That could be, but George, I want to bring this to you. It does feel like the president, they have started to send out these economic plans right now, but the bulk of his message on the stump has been, yesterday in New Hampshire talking about Mitt Romney's record in Massachusetts and basically a get out the vote message. In some ways, they've ceded this argument of change to Mitt Romney in the final days.
I think that's right. They're saying Romney is the candidate of change, but we don't like the change. Now, Andrew, if I just heard Andrew right, he said, vote against Romney because he would balloon the deficit. That's an odd argument for voting for the man who added $5 trillion to the deficit. That's Mr. Obama's...
We know that the recession added $5 trillion to the deficit, which was caused by the previous administration. And we also know that Romney's policies will increase the debt massively, immediately.
But voters believe that Obama's will do so much more harm. I mean, I think that's the problem.
Wrong.
Voters, unfortunately, are choosing between two men, each of whom are far from perfect. I think that's why you see a lot of the messaging in the final days is very negative.
And one of whose math does not add up. One of whose math will lead to balanced budgets, one of whose math will not,
I don't want to skip over George's point about change, because that was an interesting change in Mitt Romney's speech this week. He kept talking about big change. You want big change? I can bring you big change, which is something that underdogs do. I mean, that challengers do. We've heard Bill Clinton do it. We heard. Well,
it's the classic challenge.
We heard Barack Obama do it, certainly. But the hopey changey thing is now benefiting the Republican this time.
That's right, and it's transcended to their signage. I mean, it really is their closing message.
More than any election since at least 1980 and arguably 1964, this is about the proper scope and actual competence of government. It's not going to come down to a nuance. It's going to come down to a basic feeling people have. Who understands government better?
I think that's fair, though it will be interesting to see. If you had a huge hurricane that affected people, sometimes you can get changes. You can get changes in people's view of the government. Well, either positive or negative. They can get really angry that the response wasn't big, or they could say, whoa, do we all want to be on our own when something like this happens?
And one other potential surprise this week, or at least piece of news that could factor into people's judgments, we're going to get that final unemployment report coming out on Friday. You're an economist. Of course, you're also partisan, supporting President Obama. But looking at the numbers right now, what are you expecting to see and how much difference will it make?
We've seen over the last year and a half that unless they're unbelievable outliers, 1 month's numbers don't seem to crack through the shell that much. Now, that said, we had a probably artificially too optimistic number last time, so there'll probably be some rebound. But at the same time, the economy's been improving, so I think most people are expecting the unemployment rate not to move very much.
In people's views right now, more people believe the country's going in the right direction right now. But from what you're saying, you could see jobs created, but the unemployment rate still go up.
Tick back up. That can definitely happen on a monthly basis.
So let's also look at, everybody's been talking about how close this race is right now. And I want to show one ad that President Obama is running down in Florida, some of the other battleground states, emphasizing how close the race is.
537. The number of votes that changed the course of American history.
Florida is too close to call.
The difference between what was and what could have been. Make your voice heard. Vote.
And that's why both campaigns, George Will, have spent so much time and effort in these last weeks focusing on turnout above all else.
It's an American tradition. Woodrow Wilson was elected because he carried California by fewer than 4,000 votes. Lost Minnesota by fewer than 400 votes. This is nothing new in America. And one of the beauties of the Electoral College system is we quarantine our close elections and the litigation that's apt to follow them in one state, rather than pouring all the ballots into one big pool and having litigation in every precinct across the country.
But you know what that ad is supposed to do? It's supposed to freak Democrats out. That's all. It's supposed to remind them of their worst day ever, which is the day that they lost the presidency. They think either because people didn't show up to vote or because the Supreme Court didn't do what they wanted. So there's a guy in Washington, Curtis Gans, who runs it, who counts every 4 years, gives a very gloomy count of how many Americans don't vote, and he's usually correct. What both campaigns want to do now is raise that number and make sure the people who show up are their people, and that's all that's left for these last 2 weeks.
That's right, and Andrew,
not just in the battleground states.
I want to get you on this because one of the other arguments the Obama campaign makes is that a lot of these national polls, especially the Gallup poll, which has consistently showed in the last week or so a 5 to 7 point lead for Mitt Romney, is simply missing these Obama voters who are going to get out again.
Well, we have two polling universes right now. We have Rasmussen and Gallup in one corner showing one race, and all the others showing another, which is dead even. According to Gallup and Rasmussen, we're headed for a landslide for Romney. Remember last year, though, Gallup predicted in its last poll for Obama an 11-point victory, and he got 7. So they missed last time by 50%, by a huge amount. I don't know what's going on out there, George. None of us does, I think. I think it's going to be extremely close, and I think like Nicolle, I think that this is going to be about Ohio. And I think it may be just the auto bailout alone, of all the policies, of all the arguments.
Or it'll be about miscounting Latino voters, or people who don't respond to hardline phone calls, or just the science of polling.
Or the number of times I've refused to pick up my phone when I can see it's a research firm.
You're not alone there.
But nonetheless, I think our nightmare, frankly, I think maybe we can all agree on this, is that there is some electoral college popular vote difference.
See, one gets one and the other. Scenario is actually that it doesn't just come down to one state like Ohio and we're up to that. It's that you got 4 or 5 states, and each one of those 5 is in that circumstance, and then we're in total confusion waiting for it.
And we have December 31st coming up. It's not like we have all the time in the world to make these decisions.
And if you talk about Ohio, they don't even count all the absentee votes in Ohio until November 16th. It'll take longer than that for the provisional votes. But Andrew,
headache as you speak.
George, responding to someone on the nightmare, because you talk about polls. Last time around, our ABC News Washington Post poll had President Obama's number dead on, 53%. Now they've got Romney at 49%. Talk about the possibility. Governor Romney wins, the popular vote loses the Electoral College.
We've had, this is our 57th presidential election. In 52 of them, at least, the popular vote and the electoral vote have coincided. John Quincy Adams in 1824, Hayes over Tilden in 76, Harrison over Cleveland in 88, Bush over Gore in 2000, and that's not a bad record, 52 out of 56. So I wouldn't worry about it so much. And if one wins the electoral vote and loses the popular vote...
2 out of 3, though.
I think 2000 was a moment of great crisis in this country. And I think a lot of the polarization in this country, after with 9/11, is what's caused this country to be what I would call a cold civil war.
It would become even more partisan coming out of that.
And it would become even worse.
And to pick up on Andrew's point, this will all be happening, Nicolle, as we face this December 31st deadline when the tax increases would hit, spending cuts take place, and approaching the debt limit.
Look, and this is part of Romney's closing argument also, that the stakes are too high. Mitt Romney is running as a turnaround artist. He's running as a guy that can fix big problems. And this is what I think is helping to fuel his surge in the final days. And I think this is also why people aren't as disturbed that his positions tend to evolve. People have historically low views about the competence of government. And if they know one thing about Mitt Romney, even if they're not voting for him, he is the guy that kind of turned around the Olympics and that can get things done.
With the federal government funding him.
Well, look,
I'm sorry.
You
can't say you're a turnaround artist when you rely upon federal funds. I'm sorry.
In this partisan, polarized environment, Gwen, we're also seeing a huge racial gap. 6 out of 10 voters, according to the latest, white voters voting for Governor Romney. About 8 out of 10 minorities voting for President Obama.
Well, and not only that, but there was an Associated Press poll that came out this weekend that showed that actually the majority of Americans still admit, now this is a computer online poll, so people, I guess, are more honest than they are in a telephone poll, still admit racial bias. Now, that we elected a black president, so we didn't expect it all to go away. But theoretically, in a very tight race, if that affects 5% of the vote, which is what the assumption is, that could affect the outcome as well. Just pure animus. I don't think most people like to think that way, like to think that that's where America is. But I don't think you can ignore, it would be naive to ignore that as a factor.
If Virginia and Florida go back to the Republicans, it's the Confederacy entirely. You put the map of the Civil War over this electoral map, you've got the Civil War.
I don't know.
You're rolling your eyes, George.
Right? Am I wrong?
You are, and I'll show why. Democrats have been losing the white vote constantly since 1964, so that's not new.
John Kerry lost the white vote.
Here's what we're trying to talk about. 2008, Obama gets that many white votes. This time the polls indicate he may get this many. We're trying to explain this difference. Now, there are two possible explanations. A lot of white people who voted for Obama in 2008 watched him govern for 4 years and said, not so good, let's try someone else. The alternative, the Confederacy hypothesis, is those people somehow, for some reason, in the last 4 years became racist.
No, that's not my argument at all, George.
Sounds like
Please,
it.
No. I'm just pointing out the fact that the white people who've changed their minds happen to be in Virginia and Florida. And if you actually look at the map, they were the only two states in the Confederacy. Let me just point out, they were the only. It's the Southernization of the Republican Party. They were the only two states in 2008 that violated the Confederacy rule.
Andrew made an empirical statement that is checkable and false, which is that the people moving away, the white people moving away, are in those two states.
And a lot of them were Republicans.
Which Confederate state is for Obama right now?
No, look, the thing
one more time to test it, this
little.
could be Ohio, because that's where President Obama is focusing on now, the white male vote in Ohio. We'll see if that holds up.